Hi, Mariko. Nice to see you.
Hello, nice to see you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and welcome to the show.
Thank
Excellent.
you for having me.
Yeah. Well, we've been in contact quite a bit, back and forth. I think we have to cancel one meeting, but we were able to rebook it, and here we are finally talking about your many books, but focusing on primarily the Blossoms on a Poison Sea.
Thank you. Yes, well, should I go on with that?
Yes, you can talk about the book, but why don't you also include a little bit about yourself, who you are, what your background is, and we know you've written other books too, but we're going to focus on this one first. And tell us a bit more about yourself, your backstory.
So, I came with my family to the US when I was 8 years old from Japan. Um, my father was a scientist. He actually later on became the first person to determine the age of the moon. And when Japan was still sort of caught up in post-war in the 50s and 60s and things like that. So he came over as a postdoc um, and by himself and worked for a few years and decided that he wanted to take another job at Caltech. He had various offers. So he decided the family should come over for a couple of years. So we came for just 2 years, it was supposed to be, but then he continued to get offers. And finally, he ended up at the Federal Center in Denver. That's where I grew up. But I was 8 and I came. And then when I learned English, which took, as maybe a year or something like that. But as a kid, you just sort of pick it up and
Yeah.
you're okay with it. But as soon as I learned to read English, I just fell in love with books. I just
Mhm.
love books. Read maybe like 3 books a week or something like that. My mom was continuously taking me to the library. So I love books, and I always thought that I wanted to be a writer. Um, but English was my second language. I spoke it fine, but whenever I wrote, it was uh, some people would say it was really gibberish. That's a common thing with second languages.
Yeah.
Conversationally, you're fine, but when you start writing, it just doesn't make any sense
I
for some
can't
reason.
imagine what that's like, but yeah.
Yeah, so I even started taking writing in college, but I'm sure they were all well-meaning. Teachers, professors took me aside and said, your English really is very poor and you'll never be a writer. So in the Japanese world, you should have an honorable profession, which would be like become a doctor, become a lawyer, become a scientist. And so
Okay.
I went on to law school and actually became the first Asian woman to be admitted to the bar in Colorado.
Hmm.
So I practiced law, not liking it at all, and always wishing I would have become a writer. And so I started taking creative writing classes at night, so on, and I just loved it. So
Wow.
I was able to retire fairly young, and then I just started writing full time. And so far, actually, I've written 7 books. One was really long time ago and before digital, and it's out of print now. But I still have, I believe, 6 books that are available.
And they're all different. They're all different kind of books.
Oh, totally. I would have made some money probably if I could have written like a series or one specific genre. But I just had so many different things that interested me, and then I just sort of went with it, and never could figure out why my following wasn't big enough or something like that. But
Yeah.
that's what happens, right?
Well,
But there is a commonality to all my books, which is that they're all either set in Japan or they have Japanese protagonists. So there's some theme there. I try to include some cultural themes if it's appropriate. Almost all of them are historical fiction, I didn't mean for that to happen at all. I just sort of liked something in history and thought, well, that'd be sort of interesting to write about. And then I'd create characters, and then they would sort of tell that event in their own way. Um, and all of a sudden, I looked back and thought, gee, you know what? I write historical fiction. So that's where I am.
Okay, historical fiction is really interesting, and it's one of my favorite genres for sure. So, Blossoms on a Poison Sea, that would be historical fiction as well?
Yes, it's based on true events. Started in 1956. This was the probably the worst um, industrial disasters in the world, especially after technology started. So that was in 1956, and what happened was that this company called Chisso started making PVC pipes, and the discharge from their waste what included mercury. Now, in the beginning, they didn't know this, and I don't think that they were trying to pollute
Yeah.
the ocean and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
there was this beautiful bay that might be sort of like San Francisco Bay or something like that. And the fishing families were the poorest, and they lived off of the seafood that they also caught, as long as well as selling the fish, of course. And so what happened was mercury would get discharged into the water, sea life would eat the mercury, and then the people would eat the mercury, and they would then have this neurological effect that they later called the Minamata disease, mainly
Hmm.
because it was in the Minamata Bay, and the Minamata, the city itself was where this company was located. Because it was really, really a very important and large corporation at the time. And this is post-war. I know that it's 11 years after the war, and in the US, things were going great guns. But in Japan, there was still a lot of problems with enough food or enough housing.
Yeah,
So much was firebombed that people didn't have
absolutely.
a
Yeah.
place to live and so it was still a very difficult time for the country. So the people there were very dependent, and it was on this company, and it was really like a company town, you might
Hmm.
call it.
Yeah.
So people didn't want anything like this to be getting out and having the factory shut down. The government didn't want it to shut down. Um, the media, everyone was sort of in cahoots. The government, the corporation, and even the people. People, especially who were not fishermen, the more the affluent people. If you owned a clothing store, you depended on the tourism. You
Yeah.
depended on the people that lived there to buy your products.
Yes.
So it actually took 12 years to actually have this owned by the government and the company, even though within about a year or so, the researchers had figured out what was going on, but they were all being suppressed information. And so people continued to get very ill. Uh, they would be paralyzed. They would die. If you were lucky, you died. If
Yes.
not, you could be maimed and paralyzed and in horrible pain for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I created two main characters uh, and to tell the story about this. Yuki is a fisherman's daughter. Her family are, everyone in her family is afflicted with a disease. And then she falls in love with Kyo, who happens to be the son of the executive for the company who is in charge of wastewater discharge. So they get together and they're trying to battle. They do battle the uh, company and the media. And finally, they just not the two of them. There were all sorts of organizations that were trying to help. So that's the story, although I condense it into 5 years instead of 12, because that's a long time for a reader to have to go through.
Yeah, I
So
suppose it would be, yeah. It's very pretty cover. Is that like a watercolor? That's what it reminds me of.
Well, the artist that did this, she called it, what did she call it? It's something like when it's something older, when you're trying to depict something that's older, so
Hmm.
that's not quite in focus. So
Yeah,
it has that dreamy kind of a feel to it. And so those are the two main characters that you see on the cover. Two main characters, that's Yuki and Kyo. And then you can see that's part of the Minamata Bay, and then the factories behind it.
that's really nice. How long did it take for you to write that?
It usually takes me like a year to write a book,
Yeah.
but this one, there was so much research, so much research. And since it was back in the 50s, it's not like I could just go and read everything digitally.
Hmm.
So I had to buy books. Like I have a couple here that I really depended on a lot on, that were actually written at the same time as the events were going on.
Okay.
Uh, these two, they were written in Japanese, and they were written by people who actually lived there and so on.
Hmm.
And then there was a lot of online research, of course, and then there was a DVD that I just coincidentally found, and it was from a documentary. It's black and white from the 50s. Um, that was it's just horrifying to watch that DVD. Um, some people that have read my book here, like my friends, I told them where I had done my research, and from there they have borrowed my DVDs, and it's getting passed around, and people are watching it. But there was so much research, and then so ultimately, it probably took me 3,000 hours to write this book.
These fictional characters are they in love with each other?
Yes, they do fall in love
Yeah.
eventually. Uh, the story goes 5 years. They're still teenagers when they meet, and
Hmm.
then they're struggling through trying to help her family
Yeah.
uh, and everybody else, and trying to bring the truth out. But it's been hidden and being covered up. And Kyo, the boy protagonist, um, is battling his own father, who is part of this cover up.
Yeah.
Uh, and all sorts of things happen that I hope portray the culture at the time,
Mhm.
which would be in the 50s.
Yeah.
And to portray that as accurately as possible, I watched a whole bunch of Japanese movies that were made in the 50s.
Yeah.
That was really fun to watch those too.
You say 12 years. So 56, that would be, it would have been by 68 or near the end of the 60s when things finally got better and the cover up was gotten rid of. And were some people brought to justice in that, or how did it finally turn out in real life?
Uh, then there was a lawsuit that lasted 5 years, and each victim was given just this nominal, like a few $1,000s.
Hmm.
And part of it was that they had to set up the government, the company and all had to set up this sort of like a home where a lot of the victims could be taken care of. So that was done and all, but we're talking, by the time they were doing this, it was in the 70s. So that
Right.
was 50 some years ago. And
Yeah.
it's taken, and then they were supposed to clean up the bay. They drudged everything up. But one of the problems is that mercury is a heavy metal. So it sinks to the bottom.
Hmm.
So that was one of the reasons that it was a little more difficult to discover what was going on, because it was in the bed in the
Yeah.
so every time they were removing it and dredging it up, a lot of the mercury again sort
Would
of,
rise and fall and yeah.
yes, that kind of stuff. So as of today, supposedly the bay is clean. Tested they tested all the time. They're fishing out of there. You can see they've made like parks, right there, sort of dedication and things like that.
Yeah.
And They say it's all taken care of. So,
Mhm.
but there are a number of victims who were very young, or even some of them were congenital babies,
Mhm.
so that if the mother had it, and then the babies had it. So
Yeah.
some of them, a lot of the victims are still alive in their 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
some even a little bit younger, and
Mhm.
they've been afflicted with it all their life.
I'm wondering during that time between 56 and 68 over here in North America, specifically in the United States, the students were rising up and saying no to the authorities. They're not going to go to war in Vietnam. And, there was activism going on. There was the civil rights movement, and there's the women's movement that followed that. And in Japan, was it different during this time? Were people allowed to stand up and protest against this?
Things were very different. It's a very homogeneous culture. People tend to follow orders. It's a very orderly kind of a society. But there were in Minamata anyway, in that city, there were a number of marches, sit-ins. Um, there was a couple of them turned into riots.
Hmm.
Uh, People were so frustrated.
Yes,
Uh,
I imagine.
Families were starving to death, and so on. So there was that, but there was nothing else anywhere else. Just in that one city. That city is in a very southern island. Japan is comprised of mostly four. It's a chain of four very large islands,
Yeah.
and this occurs on the very southern island. Tokyo is in the middle of the largest island.
Yeah.
So actually, until probably well in the 60s or later, people in other cities didn't even know about it.
Yeah.
And in 1971, Life magazine heard about this disease, and they sent this photojournalist, W. Eugene Smith, to document with photographs and some writing. And so he was there, I'm not sure, 6 months or something like that. He was at that time married to a Japanese woman who was bilingual and had been living and working in the US.
Hmm.
So, so they were in Japan. And then in 1971, there was a big spread. It was like the center spread. That's when I first heard about this. Is my mother showed it to me in
Right.
Life magazine and talked about it,
Right.
and horrible, of course, all the photos and everything. And then I probably forgot about it, but I don't know, like 6, 7 years ago, I started writing this a long time ago, and
Yeah.
then and then my agent couldn't sell it, so I sort of put it aside and I wrote other books, and then. Oh, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, for some reason, that came back to me, and I thought, well, maybe if I did some revision, maybe it would be sellable or something like that. And so I started to work on it again.
Hmm.
But W. Eugene Smith, the photojournalist, actually, Johnny Depp made a movie about this and was called Minamata. Came out in 2020. It didn't get a lot of press because just when he was bringing it out, there was the Amber Johnny Depp
Oh, yeah.
scandal. He was being blackballed by Hollywood. They wouldn't
Right.
bring his movie out, and they were shunning him and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
And so it took a while for him to bring it out, and it didn't get as much play because of all that was going on. And then there was the pandemic all at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was sort of worried when that came out because I thought, well, I'm just about done with this book. And Johnny Depp, of course, he has all the money in the world, and am I competing with him? But when I saw the movie, I saw that it really was totally different. It was about the disease, of course, but it was really about the photographer and the problems he was having personally, and so on. So, and that was set in 1971,
Okay.
1771, whereas my book starts in 1956. My book is more the genesis of the whole problem.
When was the book published?
February of this year.
Okay, so yeah, it's November now. So have you got any records for sales and how it's being received?
As well, it's published by Northampton House Press, and they only give you an update every 6 months.
Okay,
So the first 6 months, I probably most people that you interview might say something like, certainly not the numbers I was hoping for.
right.
But we've entered a number of contests, the books, and a lot of my other books have won a number of contests. But that's always a year later
Yeah,
than
it
when it
is.
comes out, and I'm hoping that those might create more excitement about the book, and that I think is an important book. Not only I think it's a great plot, it's fun, and it's a page turner, and certainly a lot of people have told me this,
Yeah,
not just me as the author talking, but I think it also sends a very important message about industrial pollution and things like that, and the cover-ups that as we all know, these things
sure.
continue.
Yeah.
Continue.
And also, learning about other parts of the world. If you're into history and geography, historical fiction, uh, is a perfect blend of learning about things while being entertained by the fictional aspect of the historical event. I was going to ask you, who do you think this is for? Who would be interested in this?
Both men and women have seemed to like it equally, um, and obviously, people who are there are a lot of people who just love historical fiction.
Yes, of course.
So that genre, um, the the protagonists are late teens, so that you can even get young adults
Hmm.
interested in this. There's romance, so people who like romance can get behind it also. Uh, People who I especially wanted people who were sort of like activists, you might say,
Yeah.
to be involved. I also really was hoping, still am hoping, that perhaps like teachers, educational people could see this as a lot of fiction are used in schools
Yes,
to teach certain aspects of history. It doesn't have to be necessarily history, but some
sure.
topic.
Well, we did mention that you have written other books as well. Do you wish to speak a little bit about some of those?
Sure. So I started out writing middle grade and young adult mainly because I went to a long time ago. I went to a workshop. I think it was taught by Richard Bausch. I don't know if you remember who he is. Oh, well, you're Canadian. Anyway, he was a writer and an English professor. And I submitted, you're supposed to submit some work to discuss. And he said, and it was supposed to be an adult book. And he said, the most interesting character in here is this 12-year-old girl named Ayumi. I think you should write it from her point of view. But if you do that, it needs to be a middle grade book since it's a 12-year-old. Thought about it. Oh, I thought children's books were all like poo-poo, easy to write, not to be taken seriously. So wrong. I was so wrong. Um, so I was going to pitch an editor at a conference, and not an editor, an agent. And so I thought about what he said, and so I took just the first few chapters and I rewrote it from her point of view, and this agent just loved it, signed me on like immediately. And I didn't know much about the publishing world. And I never thought to ask, what do you represent? Well, she only represents up through young adult. So because of that, everything from then on, I was writing, between the ages for like 8 to 18, something
Okay.
like that. And then now I'm looking for a new agent for more of my adult books right now. So I started out with this one here, Ayumi's Violin. This was my first book, middle grade, and again, historical fiction set in 1959, where a violin prodigy is the product of an American GI during World War II and a Japanese woman. He leaves to go back to the U.S. without knowing that he had fathered the child at all. So when she's 12 in 1959, her mother dies, and so she's sent over to the U.S. to live with her Caucasian father. He's married with a daughter about her age, and they don't want her. So she has to somehow have them accept her without losing herself. And she's also a violin prodigy who's, I shouldn't give everything away, but whose violin is destroyed by some bullies at school. So she has to figure out what to do about that. So she runs into a lot of obstacles,
Wow.
and to try to make her way in the new world. Then I wrote this Accidental Samurai Spy, one of my favorites. It is such a fun book. Again, this is set in the 1863. You might remember Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai,
Yes.
the,
Yes.
the movie, the movie.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that was from when Commander Perry was sent to the U.S. Was sent to Japan from the U.S. to make Japan open its doors, because Japan was a very isolated country until about that time.
Yeah.
They didn't want any foreigners. They didn't want to interact with any foreigners. That's why it's so homogeneous, because you didn't let anyone in until about that time. Okay, so then The Last Samurai is when they're trying to westernize Japan a little bit,
Mhm.
and they want to do away with the samurai class, and the samurais don't want that to happen. So there was sort of like a civil war going on, and that's what the movie was about with Tom
Right.
Cruise.
Yeah.
So my book here in The Accidental Samurai Spy, I take that same period of time, the same events of clans battling each other, so that one wants to join the new Western world, the other faction, they want to retain the old world. They want to remain samurai. So I do in the same way, except that it is with a 12-year-old boy who happens to be a samurai lord's heir. I really like the cover on this one.
Yeah, I love the cover. I think it's great.
The cover artist I was using at the time was giving me covers that I thought were sort of tame. So I told her what I wanted, and I think I went like on Shutterstock or something like that.
Yeah.
And not this exact, but she was really, really great. The one that did for my books, she did. I wanted something that would really stand out to kids,
Yeah.
And so I saw something like an active ninja, and I'd say, well, can you make him into a boy instead of an adult? And he has a loyal dog who's very instrumental in the book. So I said, can you add a dog? She says, oh, that's easy. So she adds a dog, and I said, you know what? Can he be holding a sword, a samurai sword?
Okay.
Swept Away is
Mhm.
a young adult. This is based on the 2011 tsunami. I don't know if you remember. In 2011, there was a huge earthquake just right at the edge of Fukushima, this town.
I think
And
we all remember that one.
do you remember that?
Oh, of course we do. Yeah. It's
So
well
about
known.
16,000 people died.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
So Swept Away, I take a 14-year-old boy whose family is killed in the tsunami. He's the only survivor, so he has this huge guilt about being the only survivor. He's sent to Tokyo to live with his estranged uncle that he's never met. The uncle turns out to be a Yakuza gangster. And when war breaks out between the gangsters, he's sent away to a sumo wrestling training center to keep him hidden and to keep him safe.
Mm-hmm.
And there he becomes much stronger physically, but he's worried about his uncle, the only person that he has left in the world. But he has this broken spirit that he has to revive in order to be able to use any of his physical strength that he now has. Yeah. So it's about that. So you can see they're all very, very different. They're all very different. This is my how to write a middle grade book kids will love. So this is a nonfiction on how to write a middle grade book.
Your book, The Accidental Samurai, for instance, what makes the writing style different from, say, The Blossoms on a Poison Sea?
So children's books should be as entertaining to adults as to children. Good. This is if it's written correctly, if it's written well, an adult should be able to enjoy it. I mean, I read middle grade young adults all the time and find them just as fascinating as adult books. There are, especially when in young adults, you can write practically anything, just like an adult book, except that the protagonists are always going to be somewhere between the ages of 14 and 18.
Okay.
The age of the protagonist is the age group of your target audience, always.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
But you always want to make that your protagonist the upper end age group. Now, when you get to middle grade, and I teach classes on that, on how to write middle grade books, then the rules change because you have gatekeepers. You have parents, you have teachers, librarians, and they're the ones that basically, sort of vet to make sure that the content is correct or non-offensive or not too violent or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
They tend to be shorter, and of course, the protagonists are going to be somewhere around 12 years old because that's the end group. You usually don't want as much violence, although I have to say that in my books, I do have violence. I like writing violence. But they're not, but kids never get hurt. There might be fighting and stuff like that, but kids never get hurt. You don't want to have swearing. You usually don't want to have sex.
Mm-hmm.
You usually want to do things like shorter sentences, not as much internalization as action. Kid, let's say 10 years old, that's the right market for a middle grade. They don't want to read about, well, I could do this and, thinking through all of the ramifications like an adult fiction book might.
Sure. So
kids don't want to be doing that. So you want to sort of get right to the meat of it, a little reflection, but you need your action to be moving. You want your plot to be moving. Something has to be going on.
I asked earlier before we started recording if you have a website. You said you do. You want to talk about it?
Oh, sure. So my website is my name, marikotatsumoto.com. And on there, of course, I talk about my books. I have a bio and some photos of me when I was still in Japan or when I was young and that kind of stuff. And just talking about a little bit about my life. And then I also talk about the fact that I offer critiquing services, sort of like developmental plot kind of services, helping, like right now, there's a gentleman writing a middle grade book, and I'm helping him with his plot line and his characterization. He actually found me by reading my book. So I talk about, so we're going back and forth, he works on something, sends it to me and so on. And then I'm helping a friend of mine with a memoir, uh, really, really interesting memoir. As you know, if it wasn't an interesting life, there's nothing to write about. But
Sure.
his life is very interesting, and he actually was my first creative writing teacher.
Wow.
And he was this young guy. I remember going to class and thinking, "Oh my God, could he be like my son? He's so
Yeah.
young." He was just this young guy teaching. He's a wonderful writer. He's a beautiful writer.
Excellent.
Um, anyway, he got caught up in making a career, not writing, making a career, having family, all that kind of stuff. And now that he's a little bit older, not that he's old at all, a little bit older, he's writing this memoir. It's very, very, very touching, and it's a lot of things happen to him in his life. Still is happening to him in his life.
Yeah.
But I'm helping with his memoir. That has been just really so much fun to talk about his changes, his inner changes as he's gone through his struggles, and making his book have sort of a like a full circle at this point, and it's been really fun. But anyway, I went off on a tangent. So I really, really enjoy doing these. They're not really like editing, but helping these writers
Ah,
to
you're guiding him, you're helping him. Yeah. You're
yeah, and
supporting him, right?
see if we could develop this character better,
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun.
And for you, what are your plans for your next book?
Well, I'm almost done with my next book, and I am uh, still looking for an agent that represents adult books. This one, another historical fiction. Oh my gosh, set during World War II in an internment camp. There was a big internment camp in southeast Colorado, right here in Colorado. And I know that there are a number of fiction, historical fiction about that period of time in the internment camps and stuff like that. And I wanted to go beyond that and talk about subject matters that in the Japanese culture is sort of like shameful. They're hidden away, they're not talked about. And I wanted to bring that to light. So in this book, they're in camp, and a lot of people are very frustrated because they've lost everything that they've ever worked for. Uh, and they're locked up in this 1 mile by 1 mile camp with 8 or 9,000 other people. So there's a lot of it is domestic violence
Hmm.
because her father, is very frustrated, starts uh, beating up her mother. And the protagonist, who's 20 years old, a young woman, wants to stop that, but is unable to. Um, and then she also falls in love with a Caucasian guard
Right.
there at camp. So that complicates all sorts of things because they have to keep that also very hidden. And a very little known fact is that um, there were hundreds of POW camps in the United States where we kept like German captured soldiers, Italian soldiers, whatever.
Yep.
Hundreds of them camps in the United States. There was one very close to this internment camp. This part's true,
Okay.
and because a lot of the people a lot of the men were off fighting the war. They didn't have enough people um, for agriculture to grow crops, to harvest and things like that. So
Yeah.
what they were doing was they would take volunteers from the internment camps and POW camps, and they would bring them, and they would be able to for a few weeks or a few months or whatever, they would harvest or whatever. They would have their own housing. They didn't have to. They weren't being incarcerated or anything like that.
Yeah.
By and large, the Japanese Americans that were interned, they were very peaceful. There was hardly any problems or anything like that, So, and then the POW soldiers and like these people from camp, they picked side by side. They
Yeah.
talked to each other, they became friends. And there was, true story, is that there was some romantic interlude that started happening between some of the women, young women. Everyone's young women,
Yeah.
and these soldiers, German soldiers, also young, and they decide to help them escape from the POW camps. That really happened. That everyone got caught. The men just went back to the POW camp, and nothing happened to them. But the women actually stood trial for treason, were convicted, and were incarcerated in prison, federal prison, during the war. This actually happened. My protagonist, well, she's also trying to figure out what to do about this man that she's in love with, who's white, and trying to figure out what to do about her father being her mother, goes and works at this farm, and somehow gets caught up in all of this escape, and is also tried for treason. So anyway, that's how my story rolls on. So there's a lot that happens in my book that is not all about how people got incarcerated and what actually, what kind of life they had. Of course, that's all within the book.
Well, when do you expect this book to be finished? Another year or so before it's out?
No. It's almost done. I expect to be finished in the next couple of months.
You want to give an elevator pitch to your latest book and tell people where to buy it and why they should buy it?
So, Blossoms on a Poison Sea. It is a novel of romance, murder, perseverance, and redemption. And if you want to know something very important about history and what happens when you have collusion between government, media, and corporations, and how many people can be totally devastated by it. And I hope that you can read this book, be entertained, and also discover something that happened a number of years ago, but is still happening today.
Sadly enough, so true. Thank you, Mariko. This has been a wonderful conversation, and you're welcome back when you get your next book.
Thank you.
Look me up. Season 5 will probably start next April and May, and I'll be looking for some authors to interview, and I'd love to have you back in the seat.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I enjoyed it.
You take care of yourself now. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, and if you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then I invite you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and even leave a comment if you wish. And if you are an author, I would sure love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing, and remember to be kind to one another.